Welcome back, everybody. Well, our speakers get situated. Just a couple last things.
How would you like us?
I'm sure you all know how to use the Google, but we always love it. One of our roles, we consider a service to our audience to introduce you to teachers so that when you feel that sense of connection with somebody and how they teach, we're very happy to support polyamorous teaching relationships, so to speak. But we certainly encourage you to go to Angel's website at angelkyodowilliams.com or Mirabai's at mirabaistarr.com. Those links will be up on the resource page on the website as well. They regularly host retreats and other events. And their books, the struggling teachers. Richard's been at this a long time and has the support of the CAC and the Franciscans, but for many other teachers in this space, buying their books is the way that they sustain themselves. And so I know that it's always a very helpful thing. And then just a couple last notes on behalf of the center. I know many of you here have been connected to us for some time. How many folks here get the daily meditations? Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Great. Well, for the 3 people who didn't raise their hands, it's something that we love to do. It's a labor of love for Richard and our team to send those out. And you can get those at our website at cac.org, as well as access to the Living School applications, to online courses. We're releasing new ones every year. We've got a bunch in the pipeline. And other upcoming programs. One other thing, a lot of folks have asked us for easier resources to share. Sometimes it's hard to go from zero to this conference. And so we're working over this coming year or two to really develop some easier entry points for folks at different stages in life. And one of the steps that we've taken in response to that feedback and that request, these cards will be available outside the doors on your way out with a simple link to cac.org/free video that'll have the Father Richard's first talk from tonight and some accompanying resources. So if you want... From the first day, I should say, yeah, of the conference. Thank you, Father Richard. And we'll keep trying to release things and to provide things that make it easier to introduce folks to this content if it's had a transformative or helpful impact in your life and you want to share that with others. And then lastly is the announcement. We're Conspire 2018. The stage is set already. It's going to be Labor Day weekend next year here in Albuquerque. And it's the next of the 7 themes of the alternative orthodoxy on process. And it's all about something that you've heard touched on considerably and probably will be more in this panel on the path of descent as the path of transformation. The idea that darkness, failure, relapse, and even death and woundedness are our primary teachers rather than ideas, doctrines, or success. And so Father Rich will be joined by Barbara Holmes, Barbara Brown-Taylor, and Brian McLaren, as well as, hopefully, Mirabai. Her name has been up there, and she reminded us that we actually hadn't invited her yet. So she's going to check her calendar and see if she can join and lead practices next year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over back to our teachers in our closing session here before our liturgy. And the first thing, there's several of them have asked, there's something I wanted to clarify that didn't come out quite right earlier, or, so I'm just going to start it out by inviting everybody to share anything that they would like to add or clarify to the comments that they've made earlier in the conference. And I don't know, whichever direction you feel the Spirit is moving.
Sure, I'll begin. Thanks. So during the break, someone approached me and said something like, what is this God the Mother business? Is it the universal Christ? Yes. And he said, I've always seen God as being beyond gender. Have you considered that possibility? And I said, yes. I have, but I just forgot to mention it to you. So I think Julian, when she experienced, not conceived of, the clever idea of the feminine face of ultimate reality, when she experienced it directly, didn't necessarily fall for the idea that therefore God is a girl. It was that she experienced an attribute, an essential attribute of ultimate reality as being unconditionally loving and absolutely incarnational. And that felt to her like the exact attributes of motherhood. And so for those of us who are in the spiritual arena, who have some voice through writing or speaking or whatever, who are emphasizing the feminine face of the divine, it's not instead of we're not replacing the masculine paradigm with a feminine one as being ultimately true. It's that there has been such an imbalance, have you noticed, over several thousand years, that it seems to require a little bit of emphasis right now. Not only that, but also, and I'm going to stop talking, not only that, but also the masculine paradigm has done a great deal of harm. Have you noticed? And so we're attempting to redress some of that harm with some of the feminine attributes of that which we know, of course, transcends all gender. And yet there are some truths expressed sometimes through focusing one way or the other. I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
It is.
I wish I had known that we were going to be asked this question. I would have watched the video so I could know what I had said. What is that phrase that you used? The
Hineni.
hineni.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I wrote that down and took notes on it because that's how I experienced the talks. I have finally given myself over to some themes, but I have almost no recollection whatsoever. Yeah. So something might surface, but I'll pass it to you first.
Well, the one I wanted to elaborate on a little bit was what I squeezed in at the end yesterday, and it's of great importance, that distinction between the world of flesh and the devil. And almost always when I teach it in the Living School, the students will ask the same question. I'm still not sure I know the difference between the world and the devil, as I was describing that. And I can see heads nodding, so it's always true. It's subtle, but it's so important. So here's the most simple way to say it. The world, or the system, is the way cultures and institutions and nations and organizations align themselves, and they align themselves naturally for their own security, validation, and self-protection. Why wouldn't they? But it's why war has tended to be the very meaning of history. It's all defending what we have. So that shadow self, which is largely hidden from us because we think it's absolutely necessary for survival, the shadow is disguised and denied as virtue. What was wrong for the individual is good for the group. So you use the example like killing. None of you would kill individually, but war is wonderful, right? You're not supposed to be greedy, avaricious, and gluttonous, but in fact capitalism and consumerism is our entire culture. This is the schizophrenia I was trying to describe. Now, what is denied and disguised at the world level, when it reaches the point that it's sanctified, idealized, idolized, and that's the correct word, sacralized, if you will. Whenever you see the beginnings of sacralization, and the phrase I used was anything considered too big to fail, too big to criticize, the budget is endless for it, you know you're dealing with something that is very potentially demonic. And it's one of the best ways to understand the demonic that I know of. Now, I'm not saying by that that every soldier is demonic. We're talking about structural sin, institutionalized evil. And most of us were not given eyes to recognize that the primary nature of evil is it takes on structural, disguised, and sanctified forms. Then we put you as individuals inside of these worldly, demonic systems, and we tell you individually to be virtuous. You see the problem? I saved this till the very last day of the class in the Living School, because it will give you an analysis for the character of evil and how most of us have said yes to it at the first and the third levels, and then feel damn guilty because we're so screwed up at the second level. You can't tell people to be virtuous when they're already on bended knee before the system and in idolization of what I'm calling the demonic. I hope the word demonic doesn't unduly scare you, but actually I want it to scare you a little bit. Because we got to recognize, as C.S. Lewis said, when the demons appear, they're not going to be dressed in a red suit with a pitchfork and speaking with the Queen's English, right? They're going to be in a three-piece suit, looking very proper and dignified, So, that's enough. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think you gave me one. You gave me one to reflect on.
Oh, good, okay.
And I think it would be a mirror. And one of the questions that people often ask me is when I'm talking about whiteness. So I'm talking about whiteness as the construct. It is the system.
The system, that's right.
So whiteness, I'm not talking about people that have white skin. So any people of any skin color can participate and be a part of upholding the construct of whiteness that was in fact developed as a concept and legally set in stone in this country in the 17th century. But prior to that, people came from places. They weren't organized by skin color. And so this was a construct, and it is equivalent to the world, to the system.
The system.
And that construct, for many of us, gets too big to fail and therefore becomes demonic at the point at which we cannot question the way that whiteness as a construct has been part and parcel to the dehumanization of indigenous peoples, Black peoples, Latino peoples, red peoples, Asian people. We had the yellow plague in this country, and other religions as well. So all of the dominant paradigms of being male, being heterosexual, being Christian, being white are all the system. And then when we participate in the system at a level in which we cease to question the ways in which that system are doing demonic things, as Father Richard says, we are in conflict at the personal level. And I believe as a society, we are experiencing the strong energetic of the conflict of many people coming into the place in which we are bumping our heads against the ceiling, of realizing how awkward we feel personally because we're in that conflict that he's talking about at the second level.
That's right.
But we're not questioning the demonic level. We're not questioning because we've all been sold whiteness and white supremacy as the thing that we just buy into. And we buy into it because, as he spoke to, because at some point that construct served itself, and it made sense that it did, but it serves itself. And when we stop questioning on the individual level the demonic activity of, I would call this, in this case, white supremacy, that's the demonic level, then we exist in conflict. We exist in conflict with our capacity for love. we exist in conflict with our capacity for recognizing the humanity, i.e., recognizing the suffering of others. And in order to do that, we have to suppress the suffering within ourselves and not feel ourselves and not know ourselves. So that's the thing that I would clarify and offer as a parallel
Perfect, yeah.
to what Father Richard is offering. And if I can just say one thing, and this is kind of not a clarification, but it's a somewhat of a celebration. And it is, we talked about the guilt being completely useless. It's a waste of time. I always say, if you really feel like you need to exercise it, you have a checkbook. And you can just exercise your guilt out in your checkbook if you really want to. And if you're feeling really guilty and you're wasting a lot of time, you can add zeros. I have a website. I receive donations. And so just exercise it there and get it over with.
I was just going to add, the key is to nip it in the bud. And none of us have been trained to recognize the whole system starts with a terribly selfish bias. Because if you don't recognize it at the system level, I'm going to say it, the demonic is inevitable. Right? It will take over. And that's what Eisenhower was saying when he talked about the military-industrial complex taking over America. It's going to happen. If you don't critique it, it will be an idol. Anything uncritiqued is eventually idolatrous. So that's enough.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the first question here, second question, I guess, is one that comes up pretty consistently, and that's about what we do with our pain. And all of the teachings this weekend seem to point to the idea that transformation requires that we take in, we allow, and we even trust both our own pain and society's pain as the seeds, as the fertilization of our transformation. So can we unpack that a little bit? Why is pain trustworthy? Do you have any cautions against that idea? And if you can share any personal examples of how you had to come to terms with that.
Who wants to start?
I'll just say that I love the phrasing of that question, why is pain trustworthy?
I do too.
What you gave me, Reverend Angel, was this immense compassion that allows you to recognize the people who are often causing the pain are themselves almost always the victims of pain. And we just, in the religious world, too easily call them, perpetrators or bad people, or gave it a moral connotation. Like I was trying to picture when you were talking yesterday, what did a 17th, 18th century white mother standing in front of a slave auction, seeing a little 10-year-old boy being sold off. She had a little 10-year-old boy at home. What did she have to kill in herself? That's right. What to
That
say
is
this
always
is
my
okay?
question. That's right.
She killed a major part of her humanity. To allow another mother's boy to be sold into slavery. She couldn't see straight.
That's right.
She had to allow herself to but you said it with such compassion. She was a victim too. And so instead of just hating her, recognize she wasn't told how to grow up or allowed to grow up. Yeah. Or even clean up.
She was a victim of the demonic.
Of the demonic,
She was a victim of the demonic.
Yeah.
And which came out of the ways in which the construct of whiteness was developed in order to serve itself and to serve the people inside of it, but then she ends up a victim of that too big to fail.
Too big to fail, yeah.
And in order to continue to belong, which is necessary in the tribal orientation, she has to also give over her belief to the idea that this person is not human, even though it's scientifically understood that every human being recognizes another human being as a species. That is just, it exists in us. We can't even deny it. So it has to be so deep.
Yeah.
And I feel the pain of how deep that must have been to deny something that is biological and physiological, a physiological and biological reality that is right there, that is built into us as the species. That had to be so deep to suppress that, to allow oneself to continue. And to me, the most potent aspect of that is that it carried through generations. That we're not talking about one group of people that maybe got caught up in the swirl of making America great. We're talking about generation after generation after generation, and the fact that that lie was handed to people in the form of religion, in the form of specifically Christianity, and the notion of manifest destiny.
I know we're almost out of time, so I'm going to try to be succinct. For me, showing up with my yes, that is, with my heart open to my own pain, opens me to the pain of the world. It's built in that when I allow my heart to be broken open, I can't help but let in the suffering of the whole world and feel it in the cells of my own body. And I think you Christians have a beautiful, so many beautiful openings into this understanding. I mean, starting with Mother Mary, who was told early on as she brought her baby son to the temple to be, I almost said baptized, same, circumcised. A sword will pierce your heart. And there is something for not only for women, for mothers and non-mothers, but for all of us, where the pain that we experience just by virtue of participating in the human predicament becomes an opening to love. And so, as I said earlier, it's not like we cultivate contemplative presence as a way of flexing our spiritual muscles to prove how we can endure, but as an act of love, we show up. And when we show up for pain, we experience what it feels like in our bodies to love the whole world.
I may offer an example. There was a question about a personal example. So I'm often asked, like, what do I see as the point for myself in which I began to be transformed? And so I was abused as a child, and it was by my caretaker, not my mother. But my mother and father separated early enough that I didn't remember my mother in the household. So this woman was my first recollection of a mother figure. So it was, as young as 3 years old. And I grew up with some years with her, maybe three or so years. And eventually the abuse was discovered, and she made a mistake, as those things happen. And so the abuse was discovered, and we were separated from each other. And so there existed in this relationship a conflict because she was my mother figure. Mm-hmm. She took me to school. She was responsible for my starting school early. I'm often called articulate, and she was responsible for that very early on. And so she was responsible for many of the things that set me on a path towards what I am often lifted up for.
Wow.
right? For the ways in which I excel or do well at things. But she was also responsible for this pain and terror, really, because the forms of abuse were terrorizing me, literally. And so at about 15, actually, my father, and sorry, Dad, he doesn't remember this story. This is how parents have a special form of amnesia, but he wasn't particularly excited about finding out that I was gay or lesbian, and so I decided, in the same way that I know that the problem of racism and white supremacy is a white problem, not a black problem, I've just decided that was his problem and not mine. And so I went to go live with my grandfather. And my grandfather lived a few blocks away from the family of the woman that abused me. And so I was 15, I found myself traveling from high school in the city into Queens, which is a 2-fare zone train, and I would be in terror at moments on the bus or the train, thinking I was going to see her, who I hadn't seen in all these years, right? At least a decade. But I was precocious, and so that actually put me somewhere in the sort of mental state of more like 17, I would say 18. And I decided that I could not live with that fear, that I would not abide by living with that fear in my body, and so decided to go and find her and confront her and ask her, why did she do this to me? And underneath it, I wanted to show her that she couldn't hurt me anymore. So it turns out, to make a longer story short, that she lived a few blocks away, literally, in the different direction. I eventually got to see her, meet her. Turns out, no horns, no red suit. She was a human being that had suffered. And all of the hints that a 4-year-old, 5-year-old could not parse out about the pain and suffering of the home that she grew up in came back to me. And it freed me. It freed me from the fear. It allowed me to receive her suffering. It took every bone in my body to not go and burn her old house down. That was there too. But I have never since been able to relate to people that are perpetrators in the same way, because I feel their pain.
Yeah.
Beautiful. You know, if I can represent our fourth partner here. Ken Wilber was asked one time, why do some people change and keep growing and most people don't? And he answered, as I remember, I heard it on tape somewhere, very straightforwardly, it comes down to their learned capacity to suffer. And he says people who can endure ambiguity, paradox, mystery, like you just represented, they keep growing. But it's suffering. It's to hold that. Then to quote our other member in the Living School, Cynthia, in her wonderful book on the third force, she says this, after Carl Jung, we thought the whole thing was to balance the opposites. And she is much more subtle and I think wise, and it's even exemplified for us Christians on the cross. It's not balancing the opposites, it's holding the opposites.
Yes.
Just the change of the verb. Holding the opposites. Like you couldn't rationally resolve that, but you somehow, God gives us the grace to hold the tension of contradiction, of inconsistency, of tragedy or ambiguity. And one word for that is suffering.
Yes.
mental, emotional, inner suffering that even the body, of course, participates in. So I'm very glad you asked this question. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is about embodiment. In various ways, all three of you have spoken to and used that word of embodiment, and it's a topic of very mixed history within our tradition, especially in Christianity. So I invite you to just speak a little bit more to the ways that that the body is helping or potentially impeding the process of waking up and growing up, or even what do you mean by that notion of embodiment and its role in the process?
Who wants to start?
I'll say that I think this is important because it is one of those words that is increasingly being used, and people are, of course, using that word differently. So I'll speak about the way in which I use embodiment. I think of embodiment, well, there's variations. I talk about embodiment as an activity, right? And so when I think about embodiment as an activity, that is to say that you show up as who you say you are, that you are embodied. And so that's a kind of a positive expression of my critique of the way in which we have a set of beliefs. And I think the way that Father Richard said is orthodoxy versus orthopraxy. So for me, embodiment in the verb sense is the orthopraxy. It is, are you showing up? Are you behaving? Is the way you are manifesting your life consistent and aligned with the ways in which you are telling yourself you believe or are intending? And when I say, are you doing that, I'm not talking about a perfection. I'm talking about, are you in the lived in a dynamic experience of leaning into that? I love the term leaning in. So are you leaning into that? And then there is, for me, the other sense of embodiment, which is about the ways in which we have been historically cut off from the body. And so literally, we are not feeling. So are we in our bodies? Are we in our feeling? Are we in our capacity to allow for the experience of pain to be felt, of joy to be felt, because they come together? And I believe that part of the impoverishment of the construct of whiteness and what had to be suppressed in order to participate in that demonic expression was to cut off feeling. So that how the answer to how does that woman who has a 10-year-old child see a 10-year-old child of the African slave on display? And I often say in the way that you say, so that people can feel it powerfully, on display like cotton candy, being sold like cotton candy. What she had to cut off was her feeling, straight forward. She had to cut off her capacity to feel her own experience of humanity. And so it is that much of the impoverishment of the development of the construct of whiteness is to not feel your own body, to not permit it, because to feel with is to feel with suffering. And if you had to feel with the suffering of the people that are subject to the persistent burden of inequity in this country, if you were feeling with it, you would question it. You would question it. Yeah. And so that's how you know that you're not feeling with it and that there's work to be done.
I think a lot of our spiritual traditions are also responsible for not knowing how to feel,
That's right.
because they encourage us to get up and out of this vale of tears. Even my beloved John of the Cross, talks about the ladder of love. Doesn't sound like such a bad thing, a ladder of love. Show me where it is, I will climb it. And Hinduism and definitely Buddhism, until those of you who have come along and really are advocating for engaged Buddhism are reminding us to come back to our bodies. We've been encouraged by the spiritual traditions, and if I may say, mostly the patriarchal version of the spiritual traditions, because the feminine is more inclined to not disconnect from the body. It's very difficult to do for the feminine, but we have been encouraged to transcend. And even as a woman, I have to say that I love transcendence. Get me out of here. It feels so good. Have a deep meditation and go away. And I was definitely trained to go away. And it's taken the whole second part of my life so far to learn how to be here and to be present and to tend this beautiful vessel of incarnation. And yet Judaism is one of the traditions that has always given its stamp of approval to physicality. It's God made the world and it was good. And we don't really speak about the afterlife in Judaism because we don't know. But we do speak about what matters is fully inhabiting this one, and how we relate to one another is the proof of the sacred in our own bodies. And sex and food and stuff doesn't have quite the stink of sin that it has in some of the other traditions.
Yeah.
I think we Christians made so much of the incarnation in the body of Jesus. And humanity was so excited about this possibly happening, God becoming flesh. But what I'm trying to present, pray that I can do it halfway well, in this notion of the universal Christ, is our concentration on the second incarnation allowed us to miss the first. The first incarnation is, I believe, the feminine incarnation, which is Mother Earth, which is physicality. The most painted image in Western art, any of you have been to any European art museum, you get tired of one figure. A beautifully dressed woman in voluminous brocade dresses holding up a naked little boy. It's
Who
called
looks
the
like a
Madonna.
man.
Again and again and again. The mother precedes the son. You see, the first incarnation we paid no attention to. It all became localized in the second incarnation in the body of Jesus. But who is presenting the naked, wounded little boy? Well, he's not wounded yet, but presenting him for woundedness is the divine feminine. And I only have this in the later chapters of the book. I first hope I'm gaining people's trust. I hope. But I'm standing on solid ground. This, again, is one of those things hidden in plain sight. The Christ existed from all eternity. That's clear in Colossians, Ephesians, the prologue to John's Gospel. But the eternal Christ was feminine. And you were moving right into that territory this morning, beautifully so. But this is so good for those of you from the Protestant tradition to understand. This was the Orthodox and Catholic archetypal fascination with Mary. It has nothing to do with logic. It has to do with archetypal truth, all right? The divine feminine, she symbolized presenting and bringing forth out of creation, which was already the manifestation of God from the Big Bang. And she was the archetype for that, right? He then became the archetype of the masculine incarnation. But probably it explains why we remain so patriarchal. We avoided the first embodiment. We basically didn't see the first embodiment. Although, as I mentioned to you yesterday, the covenant with Noah is with all the creatures, with all of the animals, with all of the plants. It's not just with the human, it's with creation itself. Can you reconfigure your minds, right? to think of our faith, for those of you from the Christian tradition, in this way? I think it will allow us to finally bend the knee before embodiment and to recognize the incarnation has been with us from the very beginning and is not just limited to human beings. What kind of selfishness made us think that way? That we alone represented the divine image. Maybe we brought what Teilhard calls the noosphere, the consciousness of it. But that doesn't mean that little beavers and little birds weren't also revealing a part of the infinite and divine mystery. So, we're getting back to embodiment, but we're getting there slowly.
Thank you.
Although we had it all the time.
So the next, I'm going to ask a series of questions that are really intended to help all of us unpack a little bit more what we mean by these notions of growing up in the shadow self and waking up in the separate self. So we can try to crystallize those concepts as much as can be helpful. So first question's around the separate self. How can we identify our own sense of the separate self? What tools do we have to work on it?
You know, I'll tell you what comes to my mind and heart immediately is part of the fun of being a human is dwelling in the separate self.
Yeah.
I mean, we're identifying it as the problem, and indeed it is, in the sense that it's an illusion, according to all the great mystics. It's not like we have to get from separation to union. Most of the wisdom beings of all traditions affirm that we already are one, and we've forgotten. And yet, you know, I come back to Ramakrishna and the tasting of sugar versus the being sugar. There is an exquisite beauty, I think, to the experience of being separate and remembering that we come from love and the trajectory back into love. If it was already just that way, we wouldn't be here. And I think this connects with the whole notion of incarnation. There's something about the separation that in itself is beautiful. And not true.
Well put, yes. I like to speak of it as negative capability. That you've got to experience the loneliness and the unreality of living in you have to, of living in the separate self, to want to go beyond it, to recognize this isn't the whole picture. You don't make a nonstop flight to the united self. You have to experience the agony, the agony of the separate self. Yeah. And a lot of people refuse to do that. They just keep dressing up the separate self with bigger houses, bigger cars, or whatever, and never fall into the loneliness of that state. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I would say that is, so the embodiment then is the tool. And by allowing ourselves to feel greater and greater and deeper, more and more deeply, we recognize in that experience the sense of separation. We acknowledge the felt sense of the disconnect, and it co-emerges with the yearning to remember. Yeah. And so I think the embodiment itself is the path, and that's why we talk about the suffering as the doorway, because it is the embodiment, it is the willingness to feel, it is the willingness to say, maybe not another car, maybe not another house, maybe I'll just feel myself today. How about that? I'll actually choose to be in the experience of that gaping hole, that wound that I feel. And and start to navigate the edges of it and feel into them, lean into those edges, and allow that to be actually part of my experience, and embrace that. And it, with that willingness to choose to feel, to choose to be embodied with our whole experience, it co-emerges with the sense of, this is what it feels to be separate, and I'm not sure I believe it. So they exist together. I'm feeling what I'm feeling, that I'm trying to fill in, is a sense of separateness, a disconnect, and simultaneously the yearning of, I'm not sure I believe it. And so the unfolding, right, the impetus, the hair on fire to reconnect. So I think that it's true, right? It's like, ice cream, and yes, Amazon. And when I stop, when I am in the practice, right, I can distinguish, there's a kind of the vibration between the joyous sense of the participation in the embodied experience, and then the hidden behind it sense of a persistent emptiness, not in the Buddhist sense of fullness, but the persistent emptiness, the persistent hole that is unfillable, that we come to terms with the recognition that it is not going to be filled by anything that is external to us. And therefore, we have to turn our attention inward to discover the divine, to be in union, to know God, to come into a place of wholeness, or in the many languages that we could possibly say, to find spirit in ourselves. And we have to go through that filling, and go, you know what? There's just not enough out there to fill that hole. And so we are thus turned inward.
Thank you. So then we can then extend that into, how do we identify our shadow self, and what tools are there to work on it, and what's the role that it plays in the process of transformation?
Oh, well, I love what Father Richard said, about the not having a sense of humor, right? And and I just think that is a fantastic and straightforward way. The inability to be able to poke holes in means that there's something that holes can be poked into. Right. And so if you're unwilling to poke, it means there's something that's being poked, and that's the overly solidified ego. There's a value to the ego. We're not saying that the ego is just like a bad thing altogether. It just is we have inappropriate relationship to the ego in terms of how we identify. So we allow the ego to take over as the primary way in which we are inhabiting our experience, and then we have this projection that we're operating, and so we're back here, and we're believing the movie that we project onto the screen of our lives. And all the while, we're back in the projection room, kind of missing the whole thing, right? So we're believing the projection, right? And we get caught up in the belief. You know how it is. You get in a movie, and you're just like in it. You're in it, and you forget that movie is not a reality, and you feel all the emotions, and so the veil begins to disappear, and so you forget right relationship with the appropriate relationship of the ego as a way in which to inhabit relative reality, so that a Mack truck is coming and you should move that body across the street and get out the way, right? And so when we have an appropriate relationship to it, we are actually in the awareness in an increasingly persistent way with our relationship with the absolute, and recognize that the ego projection is there as a way to navigate the relative reality, but it is always and ever informed by our knowing of the absolute.
I find that very often a shadow encounter feels like an ambush. That suddenly, when I feel myself jerked or snagged by a surprising irritation, offense, almost always my shadow self has just shown itself. There's a shock because you're used to being in this position. And then someone says something that offends you. I always say the true self is not easily offended. If you're offended a lot, you're probably in your false self, right? You're still holding a lot of shadow material. It is very hard to offend a true holy person. It is very hard to offend a person who's living in their true self. So watch for when you take offense, when you get ambushed by an emotion that just jerks you out of your present position. Usually, you've just confronted your shadow. And unfortunately, it's often situations where you're in dialogue, or so you don't have time to pull apart and journalize, What just happened? Why is that man so upsetting me, Or why did I let her so upset me? It's a great invitation to shadow work, usually.
May I complicate that?
Please. What a good way to say it.
And so there is also the appropriate relationship to the ego that is offended by the demonic or evil aspects of society. And the appropriate standing in that and discernment that allows us to engage and be offended by slavery, offended by inequity, offended by the anti-Muslim sentiment of our country. That is different, though, than that kind of shadow grabbing a hold of you.
Yes.
And they can sound the same.
Yeah.
And so I loved M. Scott Peck's book, The Different Drum, because it distinguished for me that what happens is that the fairly small percentage of people that are inhabiting an appropriate relationship to push back from the ego, right, that is offended, but the true self is not touched. The true self remains untouched. It's just that we're using the ego as that relational force that then pushes back or engages with the things that are out of alignment. But we can mistake the two of them.
That's right.
Because words are limited. And so you have to actually develop a kind of discernment of the difference between when you've been hooked by ego, right, versus you are standing in, and I want to use this as gently as possible, a righteous, appropriate relationship to passionate ego expression of rightful contending pushback with the things that are in our world that are out of alignment. Right. And it's right.
Yes, necessary.
You have to do the growing up in order to begin to distinguish it in yourself. So there are a lot of us that are hiding behind the expression as if it's an awakened expression, an appropriate relationship with the ego, when in fact we're hooked. But one of the things that I find is that often those same people are unwilling to engage because they don't want the shadow to be seen by other people. So the very same people that spend a lot of time talking about the relationship with the ego are therefore unwilling to engage with social realities and the collective reality because they're afraid that their ego stuff, their shadow stuff, is going to be seen by everyone. So better that they not touch the social and the collective realities. You understand what I'm saying? And so then they hide by saying that they don't have to bother with that because it's all one.
Yes,
Yeah.
good.
Right? Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Complicated, subtle,
Necessary complication.
and necessary.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate the spiritual bypass business because it's so tempting when we have both a spiritual vocabulary and a toolbox of practices to use them to check out of our experience and to check out of what's real. And so the best practice I know in terms of just what can we do to recognize the false self or the shadow self is the simple practice of sitting still and watching our minds and being, or making an invitational space or responding to an invitation to be with God, whatever your language might be. That is contemplative practice, because simply in doing so, we learn to recognize the nature of the mind and to not buy into believing everything we think. And therefore, it's much more difficult to be self-righteous, because we just naturally cultivate a witness perspective when we allow ourselves to be. And I personally find that it's really easy to chuckle at myself on a daily basis, many times a day sometimes, as soon as I have a self-aggrandizing thought, or the opposite, putting myself down. It's just a thought, and look who thinks she's nobody. And I learned that by being still.
Complicate that one too a little bit. So I have this saying, and forgive me, I speak French also, that I know people that have been sitting for 40 years and they're still assholes.
Yeah. I speak French also.
So what Father Richard talked about as the loving presence of someone people that can reflect is absolutely necessary, even if you have a contemplative practice.
Yeah.
Even if you have a contemplative practice, because the ego is bigger, smarter, and faster than you are, and it will trick you into believing that in all your watching the mind, that you have somehow transcended that.
Yeah.
And it is the mirror that allows us to see the blind spots. And do you find yourself, they say the lady doth protest too much, or the man doth protest too much, or the gender non-conforming person doth protest too much? That's always a sign. It is always a sign.
Thank you. Maybe then we can end on one final question, more of the call to action on collective shadow, as Richard was talking about, that sometimes is overlooked in the psychologizing of spiritual work. How do we identify collective shadow, and what tools do you suggest towards addressing it?
Well, I'll just look at the ministry of Jesus. Jesus always goes to where the pain is. It's rather clear. His whole life is ministry toward those who are marginalized and suffering. And I think when you go toward where the pain is, you are recognizing there's a collective shadow that's producing that pain. Almost always. Like the woman who had spent all her savings on physicians all her life, That's a statement about what has caused the suffering of this woman. But we weren't trained to look at that. We really weren't. Remember, structural sin, institutionalized evil in the Catholic world only began to be used in the 1980s with liberation theology. because evil had so been localized at the individual level. And it let the ego off scot-free. It let power, money, and war off scot-free. They could play whatever games they wanted. We didn't pay any attention to evil at that level. So my answer is, look where the suffering's at and say, what structure perhaps at least partially contributed to that suffering?
I would just say that to me, the question is connected with the notion of a collective dark night of the soul, which, having spent my adult lifetime immersed in the teachings of St. John of the Cross, I'm still trying to understand the dark night of the soul as an individual reality. And yet I know that there are echoes in that teaching that pertain to the whole. And if the dark night of the soul is characterized by radical unknowingness, I think there's something in this collective shadow that invites us to not know the solution and to allow ourselves as a community, from a small community to a global community, to first not know what the answer is to the suffering and be in the vulnerability together of the mystery before we step forward with solutions. It's a very scary space to inhabit.
And I'll just say briefly that I think that life is characterized by navigating dynamic tension. That truth is, in its nature, it is appears as a paradox. And so when you just feel like you've got to pass, right, and our society, right, or the group that you're belonging to just gives you a pass and there are no questions, that's collective shadow. You've got to just go ahead and take a look, shine a light, turn around, look at what is going on there. And so I say that in this particular moment in our nation's history and dialogue and discourse, wherever you fall, if you're just sure that your side has it all together, there's shadow there.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
There is shadow there. As Gandhi spoke about, everybody has a piece of the truth. So that if you're just sure and you've got a pass that lets you off the hook of contending with the tensions of truth, there's shadow there.
Yeah.
The opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certitude.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why. There's so many biblical passages that make that clear, but most of us were not taught that. So thank you.
And I'll just say one of the things that they talk about in that, and I talk about this in Radical Dharma, I kind of conflate a couple of different teachings, and one of them is from the different drum. And really important, in Zen tradition, they talk about the great doubt, and that is essential, and that doubt is spoken of by Scott Peck, and as necessary to move into a unitive vision and worldview. So if you haven't had doubt, if you have just been living with a kind of certitude, just say it's worth that, going back to that catalog that I talked about, that there's something there when we're certain with our small k knowing, but have never done a deep questioning of our faith, of where we stand, of where we are in a particular moment.
Beautiful. Well, please join me one more time in saying thank you to our teachers.
Thank you. Thank you.